DebtCircle Sundown brief for the 19th of May 2026. Let's take a complete look at today's action across India's debt markets, money markets, government securities, currencies, commodities, and primary bond issuances. Starting with the top 5 highest yield listed corporate bonds traded today. Berar Finance Limited recorded a yield of 19.39% with a trade value of Rs 0.10 lakhs. Ambium Finserv Limited recorded a yield of 18.98% with a trade value of Rs 0.10 lakhs. Kirtana Finserv Limited recorded a yield of 17.27% with a trade value of Rs 0.07 lakhs. Unifin's Capital India Limited recorded a yield of 16.50% with a trade value of Rs 1.00 lakhs. Midland Microfin Limited recorded a yield of 16.35% with a trade value of Rs 0.90 lakhs. Moving to the top 5 highest yield unlisted corporate bonds. Apex Homes Private Limited recorded a yield of 14.00% with a trade value of Rs 4,192.07 lakhs. Branch International Financial Services Private Limited recorded a yield of 12.00% with a trade value of Rs 5.00 lakhs. Kakinada SEZ Limited recorded a yield of 11.56% with a trade value of Rs 15,000.00 lakhs. Nuvama Wealth Finance Limited recorded a yield of 9.00% with a trade value of Rs 20.00 lakhs. Another transaction in Nuvama Wealth Finance Limited recorded a yield of 9.00% with a trade value of Rs 40.00 lakhs. Now let's look at mutual fund debt transactions. Gross purchases stood at Rs 16,569.61 crore. Gross sales stood at Rs 19,133.44 crore. Net investment stood at negative Rs 2,563.83 crore. Net investment for May, month to date, stood at negative Rs 35,046.550 crore. Moving to foreign portfolio investor activity in the debt market. Under the general limit category, gross purchases stood at Rs 715.01 crore, while gross sales stood at Rs 913.81 crore, resulting in a net investment of negative Rs 198.80 crore. Under the voluntary retention route or VRR category, gross purchases stood at Rs 99.03 crore, while gross sales stood at Rs 324.18 crore, resulting in a net investment of negative Rs 225.15 crore. Under the fully accessible route or FAR category, gross purchases stood at Rs 187.71 crore, while gross sales stood at Rs 361.21 crore, resulting in a net investment of negative Rs 173.50 crore. Net investment for May, month to date, stood at negative Rs 436.96 crore under the general limit category, negative Rs 251.45 crore under the VRR category, and positive Rs 3,563.80 crore under the FAR category. Net investment for calendar year 2026, year to date, stood at negative Rs 3,732 crore under the general limit category, negative Rs 1,655 crore under the VRR category, and positive Rs 13,772 crore under the FAR category. Now turning to money market rates. Call money rate closed at 5.21%. Tri-party repo rate stood at 5.07%. Basket repo rate stood at 5.13%. Special repo rate stood at 5.02%. Let's now look at India government bond yields across the curve. 1-year government bond yield stood at 6.06%. 3-year government bond yield stood at 6.59%. 5-year government bond yield stood at 6.93%. 7-year government bond yield stood at 7.07%. 9-year government bond yield stood at 6.99%. 10-year government bond yield stood at 7.11%. 15-year government bond yield stood at 7.42%. 30-year government bond yield stood at 7.70%. Moving to Treasury bill yields and auction cutoffs. 91-day Treasury bill yield stood at 5.34%. 182-day Treasury bill yield stood at 5.53%. 364-day Treasury bill yield stood at 5.77%. Now the latest liquidity indicators. Net liquidity injected stood at negative rupees 1,91,572 crore. Standing deposit facility or SDF stood at rupees 2,09,146 crore. Marginal standing facility or MSF stood at rupees 1,569 crore. Moving to MIBOR OIS rates. 1-year MIBOR OIS rate stood at 6.26%. 2-year MIBOR OIS rate stood at 6.51%. 3-year MIBOR OIS rate stood at 6.64%. 5-year MIBOR OIS rate stood at 6.83%. Now let's look at modified MIFOR rates. 2-year modified MIFOR stood at 7.30%. 3-year modified MIFOR stood at 7.32%. 4-year modified MIFOR stood at 7.47%. 5-year modified MIFOR stood at 0.00%. Turning to currency markets. US dollar versus Indian rupee closed at 96.68 compared with the previous close of 96.30. Euro versus Indian rupee closed at 112.233 compared with the previous close of 112.18. British pound versus Indian rupee closed at 129.26 compared with the previous close of 128.90. Japanese yen versus Indian rupee closed at 0.61, unchanged from the previous close of 0.61. Chinese yuan versus Indian rupee closed at 14.17, compared with the previous close of 14.14. Let's now review commodities and market indices. Gold, 24 carat, 99.9 purity, closed at rupees 15,704 per 10 grams, compared with the previous level of rupees 15,622 per 10 grams. Silver closed at rupees 2,850 per 10 grams, compared with the previous level of rupees 2,900 per 10 grams. Crude oil closed at $110.52 per barrel, compared with the previous level of $109.47 per barrel. The Sensex closed at 75,200.85 compared with the previous close of 75,315.04. The Nifty closed at 23,618.00 compared with the previous close of 23,649.95. Finally, let's look at India's primary corporate bond issuances for the day. HDB Financial Services Limited raised rupees 300 crore through a 36-month bond issuance carrying a AAA rating from CARE Ratings Limited. Bajaj Housing Finance Limited raised rupees 500 crore through a 36-month bond issuance with a coupon of 7.83% and a AAA rating from CRISIL Ratings Limited. Keevdana Finserv Limited raised rupees 83 crore through a 16-month bond issuance carrying a coupon of 12.00%. IFL Finance Limited raised rupees 50 crore through a 24-month bond issuance carrying a coupon of 11.75% with a BBB rating from CRISIL Ratings Limited. That's all for today's DebtCircle Sundown brief for the 19th of May 2026. Stay tuned to DebtCircle for more updates across India's debt and fixed income markets.